All right, welcome back, everyone. Today, we are going to completely dismantle one of history's absolute biggest myths. In this explainer, we're looking at the anatomy of a smear campaign, specifically the massive gap between the enduring, terrifying myth and the actual historical reality of the Spanish Inquisition. Get ready to have everything you thought you knew turned upside down, because honestly, the facts here are way more fascinating than the fiction.
Okay, let's just dive right into this by asking a super simple question. What was the Spanish Inquisition? I want you to just close your eyes for a second and picture the brutal image you probably have in your head. If you're like most of us, you're imagining dark, damp dungeons, evil friars in robes rubbing their hands together, swinging pendulums, and just an endless parade of sadistic torture, right? It's kind of the ultimate legendary picture of human barbarity and religious intolerance. And, that terrifying image has been deeply ingrained in our culture for a really long time. Listen to this super dramatic 19th century quote from American politician Robert Greene Ingersoll. "Spain destroyed all freedom of thought through the Inquisition, and for many years the sky was livid with the flames of the auto da fe." I mean, that perfectly establishes this enduring sensationalized myth. It sounds like an absolute nightmare of endless torture and burning pyres. But what if the actual records tell a completely different story?
Which brings us to part one, bureaucracy, not brutality.
We're shifting gears here from the sensationalized horror stories of Gothic novels to a surprisingly mundane reality. The truth is, the Spanish Inquisition functioned way more like a modern, highly regulated civil service. To really wrap your head around this, just think about this staggering number, 6%. When historians analyzed the raw data, they found that the actual average conviction rate of the inquisitorial tribunal was incredibly low, just 6%. So why so many trials? Well, as a strict bureaucratic system, they were legally obligated to investigate every single claim brought to them by citizens, even petty neighbor disputes over basically nothing, the vast majority of which were just instantly dismissed.
And then there's the torture. Brace yourselves for a shock to the system on this one. While torture definitely did happen, it was strictly limited by law to a maximum of 15 minutes per session. 15 minutes. It wasn't the hours or days of agonizing torment you see in the movies. It was highly regulated, strictly timed, and completely constrained by a very rigid set of legal guidelines.
What's absolutely wild to think about is how these highly regulated practices compare to modern bureaucracies. The rules were incredibly rigid. Inquisitors were absolutely forbidden from drawing blood, mutilating, or causing any permanent harm to a person. On top of that, a medical doctor had to be present at all times just to ensure those boundaries weren't crossed. Believe it or not, because secular royal prisons at the time subjected inmates to totally unrestricted torture and food deprivation, many prisoners would actively try to get their cases transferred to the Inquisition simply because they had way more rights there.
This bureaucratic, hyperlogical mindset even extended to the famous witchcraft panic that swept across Europe. Out of nearly 3,700 people tried for witchcraft in Spain, only 101 were found guilty. Take this amazing historical anecdote about Inquisitor Alonso de Salazar Frias. The guy didn't even believe in witches. When he was faced with voluntary confessions of witchcraft, he straight up refused to use torture. He basically said, actually, scratch that. These people aren't witches. They are simply mentally ill. He famously declared there were no witches in Spain until the French started talking about them.
Let's move on to Section 2, the reality of European torture. So, if the Inquisition was surprisingly mild, why is it famous for being the ultimate gold standard of cruelty? To understand this, we have to contrast its methods with the genuine, totally unregulated brutality happening across the rest of early modern Europe at the exact same time. On one hand, you have the Spanish Inquisition, literally the first judicial body in Europe to operate on a strict system of rules rather than personal whim, complete with doctor supervision and those 15-minute limits. On the other hand, you've got Northern Europe, where justice was left entirely up to personal judicial discretion, and that led to horrific, state-sanctioned terror and incredibly high execution rates. Just to give you an idea of Northern European justice, let's talk about the breaking wheel. This was a completely normal, standard punishment in places like the Holy Roman Empire and France. A criminal would be tied down, and the executioner would use a massive wooden cartwheel to systematically crush and break their leg and arm bones. After that, the mangled body was often woven into the wheel itself, hoisted onto a pole, and they were just left there to die of exposure and shock. I mean, that completely shatters the myth that Spain was somehow uniquely barbaric. I really want to emphasize this stark contrast.
While Spanish Inquisitor was legally barred from drawing blood and was literally holding a 15-minute stopwatch, victims of the breaking wheel up north could survive in absolute agony for days. In 1581, a German serial killer named Christmann Jenny Pertiga was kept alive on the breaking wheel for 9 agonizing days. The disparity in cruelty is just immense.
Okay, on to section 3, Birth of the Black Legend, which naturally leads us to a massive historical puzzle. If the Inquisition wasn't that bad compared to its neighbors, why do we all think it was? Well, the answer lies in who the Inquisition was actually targeting. When you break down the numbers, there's a huge disparity between nobles and clergy versus ordinary citizens. The Inquisition was designed by the Spanish crown to keep powerful, wealthy noble families and corrupt clergy in check, basically preventing them from dividing the empire. But here's the catch. These powerful people were highly literate. They had vast international connections, and they possessed the means and motives to write angry, hugely exaggerated criticisms about the institution that was actively policing them.
And then you add this spark that lit the powder keg, the 16th century Protestant printing press. See, Northern European Protestants were locked in this fierce political and religious rivalry with Catholic Spain, but they couldn't defeat the mighty Spanish military on the battlefield. So instead, they fought a war of words. They flooded Europe with pamphlets, like John Fox's heavily illustrated Book of Martyrs, which depicted fantastic, totally fabricated scenes of Spanish torture. It was essentially a modern-day fake news smear campaign designed purely to win a political war. The idea spread like wildfire.
Let's look at section 4. Centuries of anti-Spanish propaganda.
What started as a political weapon during the European religious wars gradually evolved into a totally accepted historical narrative across multiple centuries. This wasn't just some brief trend, guys. We can see how this paper trail builds across time. In the 1500s, Protestant presses weaponized those pamphlets. Then, in the 1700s, Enlightenment thinkers in France, like Voltaire, picked up these Protestant myths to satirize the church and basically write off Spain as a backward, unphilosophical nation. Fast forward to the 1800s, and you have United States politicians repeating the exact same myths, using anti-Catholic, anti-Spanish rhetoric to justify American intervention in the Cuban War of Independence. That is exactly how a political smear campaign turns into an accepted historical fact. To impartially summarize this whole phenomenon, modern historian Edward Peters hit the nail on the head. He wrote, "The Inquisition was an image assembled from a body of legends and myths, which between the 16th and the 20th centuries established the perceived character of inquisitorial tribunals." So centuries of accumulated propaganda had completely, 100% replaced the historical reality. Finally, Section 5, Revising the Historical Record.
So how did we finally figure out we'd been lied to for hundreds of years? Well, it all comes down to the raw data. Following the death of Spanish dictator Francisco Franco in 1975, previously closed archives were finally opened up to independent researchers. Historians like Henry Kamen went in and painstakingly analyzed the raw day-to-day data of the Inquisition. And what they found wasn't some Gothic chamber of horrors. No, they found endless stacks of boring bureaucratic paperwork. The objective data proved that the tribunals were tightly constrained, highly legalized, and drastically less lethal than the rest of Europe.
And that leaves us with a truly profound realization to end on today. We just spent our time unpacking how a 500-year-old smear campaign, fueled by political rivalry and the invention of the printing press, successfully masqueraded as objective history for centuries, which leads me to this final provocative thought for you. If a fabricated black legend could dictate our understanding of the past so completely, what modern myths, driven by our own rapid-fire digital media, are we writing into history today? Keep questioning what you read, keep looking for the source data, and never stop learning. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.